last bit of reading for the evening, a book that I feel was particularly important to me, seeing through what I thought I knew about American and world history. America's Nazi Secret. Just to touch the introduction. Now, most liberals, you don't really do quite as much research as you would hope you do. You just don't know what to look for. It takes a bit of time. Some of you know, but most of you don't. And so, here you go. You're totally welcome. Let's just start with one of the notes and then jump into some meat. Note 20 from page 12. Because Roosevelt did not trust either his State Department or Justice Department, he entrusted the post-war probe of American financial collaboration with the Nazis to Henry Morgenthau, his Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau initiated Operation Safe Haven, a program to trace Nazi flight capital back to the Western investors. After Roosevelt's death, Morgenthau was discredited for an anti-German bias at a time when America allegedly needed to rebuild Germany as a bulwark against Russian encroachment. Dulles took over Operation Safe Haven and used it as a cover for OPC's Nazi recruitment. Although Dulles destroyed the Safe Haven Index, a few of Morgenthau's original files escaped Dulles' shredder and can be found in the wartime State Department post files. For example, in the Switzerland post files, I discovered that the Operation Safe Haven investigation of Dulles himself, where he was accused of laundering money for the Nazis. My historical novel, The Witness Tree, goes into this episode in some detail. The dialogue is fiction, but the story is fact. The Safe Haven files were stolen by Eleanor Dulles and given to the Zionist intelligence service. They then blackmailed Nelson Rockefeller into pressuring the Latin American nations to give the extra votes in the UN to create the State of Israel. The problem was that Roosevelt never told Harry Truman about the atomic bomb or about his real motive for the Nazi bankers' trials at Nuremberg. The German bankers were supposed to point their fingers at their American investment partners, which would effectively incriminate the principal financial contributors to the GOP. Had he lived, Roosevelt might have succeeded in bringing treason charges against the leading lights of Wall Street. It was high time that some of them did jail time. At the end of the 1800s, some of America's wealthiest families had pooled their money to form aggressively brutal monopolies, cartels, and other price-fixing schemes. Their perfidious and predatory practices earned them the nickname the robber barons of Wall Street. There were some Democrats like the Harriman family, and later the Kennedys, but most of the robber barons were unabashedly Republicans. The Rockefeller, DuPont, Bush, and Walker families were just a few. I have always said that neither JFK nor George W. Bush should be blamed because their parents or grandparents invested in Hitler. What many people do not realize is that Joseph Kennedy bought his Nazi-era stock through Prescott Bush. They traveled by ship to Germany together before the war. Note 21. British SIS also wiretapped Joe Kennedy and even indicted his code clerk as a Nazi spy when Kennedy served as Roosevelt's ambassador to the court of St. James. I have always said that Teddy Roosevelt, arguably the most honest of the Republican presidents, was the only one in the GOP who tried to bring the robber barons to their knees. He persuaded Congress to pass extremely strict antitrust, anti-cartel, and anti-monopoly legislation. In 1918, the robber barons fought back and somehow convinced Congress to pass the Webb-Pomeroy Act. This little-known loophole law permitted the creation of American trusts, monopolies, etc., as long as it was done overseas. Because of this loophole law, investment capital left America in a great flood, one of the contributing causes of the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. During the 1920s, 3 countries were targeted for takeover by the robber barons: Germany, Russia, and what is now known as Saudi Arabia. The tactics were the same. The American cartels bribed their way into friendly governments and then protected their investments by hiring local mercenaries, paid terrorist groups who watched over their interests. In Saudi Arabia, the terrorists for hire were known as the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brothers, or more colloquially, the Muslim Brotherhood. The robber barons armed this group of fanatical Wahhabists who drove the peaceful Hashemite rulers out of Mecca and Medina and installed the House of Saud. The Saudis named the country after themselves, created an oil company, and with their American investors Aramco, and then promptly threw the Ikhwan terrorists out of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were not stupid after all. The Ikhwan settled primarily in Egypt, where they joined the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood created by Hassan Al Banna in 1928. He was a devout admirer of and correspondent with young Adolf Hitler. In heaven Allah, on earth Hitler was their battle cry. Hassan's Muslim Brotherhood became a fully integrated arm of the German intelligence and propaganda networks during World War II. They specialized in acts of terrorism and assassinations of Allied troops, promising German General Erwin Rommel that he would not find a single Allied soldier left alive when he arrived in Cairo. The Arab Nazis remained the only segment of the Third Reich that was never punished or even dismantled. Note 22 from page 14. Perhaps the organization survived because the Muslim Brotherhood came under the immediate protection of Kim Philby, the communist double agent inside British intelligence. Russian intelligence ordered all their new Arab communist recruits to pretend to be fascists and join the Muslim Brotherhood neo-Nazi websites, reluctantly admit that even Hassan Al Banna's right-hand man was a communist plant. After the war, the British Secret Service hired the Ikhwan terrorists and used them as a fifth column in an attempt to destroy the infant state of Israel in 1948. When Gamal Nasser and the leftists took over Egypt, they banned this huge army of Arab Nazis, now numbering nearly 750,000 strong. In the 1950s, the same robber barons who helped fund and create the original Saudi Ikhwan convinced their Saudi partners to take them back. The Saudis gladly accepted the Nazi refugees from the Egyptian Ikhwan and gave them citizenship. At least the Egyptian Nazis were literate. The Saudis used the Muslim Brotherhood as school teachers. It was a perfect storm of Nazi racism and Wahhabi bigotry. Note 23 from page 15. Islamic scholars declared Wahhabism as a heresy against Islam more than 60 times before the Saudis obtained their oil wealth. Now that the Saudis control the mortgages for a majority of the Sunni mosques in the United States and around the world, such criticism is muted. A perfect storm was rising in America as well when Eisenhower was elected. One of the robber baron's lawyers, Allen Dulles, former head of OPC, became head of CIA. His brother John Foster Dulles became Eisenhower's Secretary of State. Between them, the trickle of Nazi immigration to America became a flood. America's Nazi secret. Thankfully, to Scott Ritter, this was exposed on a number of shows, but I think mainly it was, that really loudmouth lady who was in Florida, but she was a New Yorker. She was a snowbird. And she called Hillary Clinton a before last election or something like that. Rhodes? Is that her last name? She was on Blue State Radio back when Chunky Ogre and Tom Hartman and all them only had radio shows, and Rachel Maddow had a radio show. This is way before anybody got on television. So what it was, Scott Ritter had talked about the ties between the House of Saud and the Bush family. And from that time until really about 4 or 5 years ago, all this information now is flooding out because of declassifications that happen every like 25, 45, 40 years, things weird markations of time. But a bunch of stuff got cleared on the British side, and so there's all this information out there about all these weird ties between elites in our government, high-level Freemasons, and these crazy groups that now we're dealing with, the Salafists and the Wahhabists. I mean, really, this is serious, weird shit that's totally for real. And all you've got to do is just look up a few interviews. Especially, I recommend the Leon Charney show. Interviews with John Loftus, Loftus, former FBI lawyer. Yeah. Truth about things, it only gets worse.